Hi, welcome to the Third Degree. I'm Craig, and thank you very much for being here with us this evening. Tonight's webinar is on grey literature, something we're probably very familiar with, but may not have given it particular terminology. So let's just ask ourselves, what is grey literature? If we do a quick search, we'll come up with a couple of really interesting definitions. The first one sort of uses some slightly emotional words: ephemeral, fringe, the alternative grey, or fugitive literature, making it sound a little bit more sinister than it really is. A more appropriate academic definition is something like: grey literature stands for manifold document types produced on all levels of government, academia, business and industry, in print and electronic forms that are protected by intellectual property rights of sufficient quality to be collected and preserved by libraries and institutional repositories, but not controlled by commercial publishers, i.e., where publishing is not the primary activity of the producing body. Ironically, the International Conference on Grey Literature provided us with that. So let's go for something that's perhaps a little less academic, or perhaps even a little less pompous. To carry out a thorough search of literature, it's going to be necessary for us to look beyond what is conventionally published books and journals. We are going to need to identify work that is either unpublished or perhaps published in a non-commercial form. This is called grey literature. So who produces grey literature? It's often generated by researchers and practitioners, but it's not controlled by commercial publishing. Therefore, it can be produced by charities, non-profit organizations, societies, special interest groups, professional associations, universities, central government and local authorities, international bodies such as WHO, World Bank, etc., businesses, market intelligence consultancies, think tanks, political pressure groups, patient and consumer groups, and many more. It's quite extensive in that respect. So, knowing that there is literature out there that could inform my studies, could inform my research, either in a preparatory mode or further down the track as I'm trying to piece together a story or a theory or a set of outcomes. So a lot of possibilities are in there. Why should I use it? Some material is only available as grey literature. For example, information that has been put together that is intended only for funding bodies, which might include things like the preliminary results of research projects, or perhaps a research project that never got taken off the ground because funding changed or something like that. It is for us an excellent source of raw data, statistics perhaps. It doesn't mean that those statistics are reliable, and we'll get to that a bit later, but it does provide us a source that we can either springboard from, utilize, or go back to the collection methods that were used and help us to inform our own studies. They are often rapidly produced and disseminated. So, for example, conference proceedings appear possibly a year over or a year or so before being in conventionally published journals. And you may have seen some of the conference proceedings, or you may even see some mock-ups for journal papers. Do not publish without permission, or do not reproduce without permission, etc. All of this still helps to inform us, even if we choose not to cite it. Information in grey literature may in fact be fuller or more detailed than what's possible in journal articles, because grey literature is not bound by space restrictions. It doesn't have a word limit. It doesn't have set parameters as to how the output must be visually displayed. Therefore, there may be more to it than we're getting elsewhere. It also enables viewpoints of individuals less likely to publish in journals to be heard. You know, if we take a social perspective, it might be the voice of patients or the voice of victims versus the voice of authority. So it gives an interesting access to perhaps not necessarily more balanced, but more open narratives that may exist. It's also more likely to be very industry or sector focused rather than from a purely academic perspective, which could in fact be wider. So it may actually give us valuable insight into a niche sector or a chosen profession. It has the potential, we have to look at reducing positive result bias. So negative results are more often included in grey literature than in conventionally published literature. So looking for unpublished material is a way of counterbalancing positive bias that may exist through commercial printing opportunities. It can be a way of obtaining geographically discrete information, so something for a very localized area or neighborhood or city. It can offer a coverage of special interest topics that are not often found through our mainstream titles as well. As such, it gives us opportunities to get a fuller picture. It doesn't give us guaranteed reliability and credibility. That's something we've got to analyze for ourselves, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it does give us a broader understanding of the landscape of what we might be researching or investigating. So let's look at what type of materials grey literature includes. So it's actually quite extensive, a list, and it's an interesting one because a lot of the things that are on here are the types of documents that I enjoy reading, not only as a researcher, but as somebody who's, I guess, naturally inquisitive as to what happens around him and doesn't always believe in the formal publication. I like to look at a wide variety of sources to help me make up my mind. So let's go through a few of these. Bibliographies, blogs, podcasts, emails, transcripts of telephone conversations even. Committee reports, whether it be informal from, say, a small neighborhood committee or something within a committee within an organization, or a government level or even local government level committee report. Conference papers, posters, proceedings, data sets, things that have been unpublished. All of these help to contribute to the shaping of our ideas. We have opportunities for discussion and working papers, something that a university may put out, something that an organization may put out, focusing on a particular industry or so forth. It can be fact sheets, data that's been put together for a certain purpose to try and influence or lobby either individuals or cohorts within a population. Government reports, white papers, parliamentary papers, guidelines, market reports, even newsletters, because newsletters still provide us a context at a micro scale. It may be things like policy documents, manifestos, best practice documents, preprints of publications. So for example, we may get a preprint of a journal article that's not scheduled to come out for maybe 4, 6, 8 months, but it still helps us to be able to look at what somebody else is writing and to use that to inform what we are doing. It may be protocols, guidelines, research reports, standards, patents, technical specifications, even statistical resources and publications, technical reports, other theses or dissertations, especially if they're very, very, very relevant and recent being the most important thing. It could be if we're looking at perhaps medical or public policy, we might be looking at trials registers, for example, clinical trials that have been happening and people's reaction to that. It can also include unpublished translations that help us to look at work that's been done in another language that is going to inform us. Papers that have been published in journals that are issued in such a small edition or maybe distributed free of charge with only a local importance. So they aren't necessarily considered traditional journal publications in that sense because they may not have a huge presence or marketable value. We can look at technical, promotional, advertising documentation. All of this gives us an understanding of themes or what contemporary practice might be or what the word on the ground is. And finally, we might have underground literature, maybe something that's published against individuals or regimes. Interestingly enough, there seems to be an overlap between some of the notions of historical research and the concept of grey literature. And the truth is there is quite a significant overlap. If you joined my webinar the other week on historical research, quite a lot of the principles of interpretation that we have from there are going to apply to us embracing and using grey literature in our research. Just because it's old, just because it's a little bit challenging in comparison to paid publication, doesn't mean it gets invalidated. But the principles of analysis that we have must apply to both. People will ask, is grey literature academically sound? So this is where it comes to our principles of analysis. The answer is going to be yes or no. Use caution, use your judgment. Without peer review, the quality of the material that is available is going to be variable. But at the end of the day, as a researcher, it's our role to verify, to validate in some respects, to triangulate, to make sure that if we are embracing and taking on board the words of others, that we do so with confidence in its accuracy. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to check both authenticity and reliability of documents. It may be missing things like author, publication date, even the publishing body may be missing. But at the end of the day, there is still going to be an opportunity for us to try and find this and to be able to analyze whether it's something that can be useful. Now, let's assume that it's something we can't track to the extent we don't have full details. Just because we can't cite it doesn't mean it's not going to influence our thinking practices. So sometimes this grey literature may not end up by being referenced in our dissertation, but it may simply influence the way in which we think. It may pose a question for us, or it may push us down a particular direction that's a little bit different to an earlier direction that we've had. Still, it's helped us with our research. Just going to put up a table for you defining aspects and examples of grey literature, grey data, and grey information. So yeah, there's a few different elements here. We do have grey literature, which is what we've talked about. The defining aspect is it's not controlled by commercial publishing organizations. So this is our reports, our working papers, our newsletters. We have grey data. It's user-generated data, web-based. It might be things like tweets, blogs, Facebook status updates. Yep, social media comes into the grey literature argument as well. And finally, we have grey information. So this is things that are informally published or not published at all. So it might be personal memories, emails, meeting notes. All of these have validity. We've just got to determine at what point and how are we going to let these shape our particular ideas and or influence us as researchers? And B, are we going to include these into our specific research communications? So either our dissertation itself, or maybe a byproduct of our dissertation, even a conference presentation, for example. The next table is a little bit more complex, and I think I'm just going to leave it here for a moment for you to read. But characteristics of different approaches to searching for grey literature and grey information. So it's really looking at a few questions, specific to grey literature, likely to find grey literature on this matter, specific to grey information, likely to find, likely to be replicable, i.e., can you repeat the study that formed the same conclusions as the literature, the grey literature, or grey information itself? Are the results likely to be up to date? And this is one of the advantages of grey literature, that there is a chance, I should say there's more than a chance, that it's going to be more up to date than some of the other things out there. But we might also be looking at historical literature or historical grey literature. So that one's debatable. The challenge then becomes, is it easy for recipients to share? That comes down to actually, can you get it? And also easy for recipients to ignore. So is this something that would have been put in the round filing cabinet or the dustbin, for example, in the time that it came out? Or is it something that would have been influential in helping decision makers, lobbyists, etc., as they first read it? Some of the characteristics we have of grey literature: it's difficult to identify, challenging or difficult to access, certainly difficult to locate, because there really isn't a referencing system for it. It's often in the form of very limited editions. So unlike a book or a journal, which may be available in multiple forms or significant quantums of copy, grey literature might have a very limited print run. It's often inaccessible via traditional bookstores or online retailers. So we've got to look at alternative access points that we can approach or engage with to obtain grey literature. There's often a lack of bibliographical registration, so we're not going to find it in our university library computer database, for example. We're not going to find it in the Library of Congress database, for example. It's effectively absent in many library collections as well as the catalogues. It's absent in publishers' catalogues because there's no money-making opportunity out of it. It's difficult to access or acquire through libraries. So again, this is the thinking outside the box. Where do I go to get my resource when I'm not going to get it through the traditional library that would be how I normally go about it? They tend to be unpublished or published with a delay, or they might even be published way in advance of typical things. And they can be rapidly distributed. Now, just to throw a spanner in the works, let's ask you a question. Here's the 50 Shades argument. Are we looking at white, grey, or black literature? And don't do what I did, do a Google search for black literature, and it does really give us something different. But it's commonly used terminology. White is considered published, grey is considered unpublished. Black literature, in context of this, is effectively ideas and notions only. So these are really the ideas that people jot down, but they don't necessarily do anything with. There is, however, still a place for the concept of not only grey literature, but black literature in the shaping of what we do. When we look at grey literature, we've got to think very much about the local importance of it. And that's where it really comes down to for many researchers, is that it is going to be geographically centered on a local area rather than a particular theme or sub-discipline. So it gives some value. For example, you know, if we are looking at communities in rural Southeast Asia, there are going to be some very interesting sources. If we're looking at a theory-based approach, we might not get quite the same rich variety. So in terms of it being localized, it's there to support versatile, actual and local information. So it might be there to inform communities rather than to inform policymakers or decision makers. It may be about supervising local authorities, the promotion of local initiatives, expressing local social opinions, contributing to the integration of the local environment, and helping to form local opinions. So you see the themes coming through, that we're really looking at what it does as part of community building and community shaping, and therefore is going to be something that's more lobby based than it is perhaps going to be, I should say lobby based in terms of the community rather than in terms of the authority. The support of local culture and scholarly activities, promotion of small homelands, economic education, providing a forum, maybe just advertisements and announcements, or even just entertainment. But it all provides context, and it's the context that's most important. Now, for us as researchers, what really becomes important is how do we go about evaluating the effectiveness or the usefulness of the resource that we've got. So Flinders University in Australia developed the ACODS checklist, and it really covers 6 key things that we evaluate each of our documents or each of our resources from. Authority, as in who wrote it and what was their relationship to the matter of research or the subject being discussed. The accuracy relates to how viable is the accuracy of the information contained therein. Is it fact? Is it opinion? Is it somewhere along those lines? Or worse still, is it alternative fact? Now, accuracy comes through from us being able to triangulate with other resources. We need the triangulation approach to overlap some of the data. You know, we may have a situation where categories don't match up, but they correlate. And that will help to give some identification and credibility to whether or not the data in here is accurate or not. Then we have coverage. To what extent does it cover the subject? Is it something in detail which suggests a significant amount of research has been undertaken in order to achieve the output that was produced? Or is it very superficial? If it's superficial, how is that going to help us as a researcher, other than just a light idea that may pass in the night? The objectivity, actually, it comes down to what was the intention of the initial piece of research? Does that align with yours? Is it even known? Can it be deduced from the information from the written communication that is there? Objectivity is very important because we need to be able to rely on the information that is provided in the context of why the information was sought in the first place. Date, obviously, I mean, okay, I look at myself as a historical researcher, that for some things it's valid, for others it's not. But for those who are doing contemporary research but using grey literature, we want to make sure that we understand where it sits in relation to every other piece of research that's out there, because that will help us to determine whether they've used old data as well in forming their conclusions, or whether or not they're still viable with what they're using. And finally, the significance. This probably can be interpreted in many ways, but ask yourself, could or did this document, did this piece of research influence policy or influence practice in the community of interest? If it did, then it's likely to be significantly impactful, that its credibility can be considered quite robust. If it was more an opinion rather than something that influenced decision makers, then we've got to argue that the significance is not sufficiently valuable in terms of its output, or significantly valuable in terms of how we might choose to go about using it. With grey literature, not all will have a named author or authors. If it does, consider whether or not the authors are knowledgeable in their field, and whether they have any affiliations that might have biased their views. For example, political manifestos are always extremely biased towards the group of individuals that they represent and support. That may mean data has been used to represent one aspect rather than to be holistic. If there are no authors named, consider closely the source that produced the report. Usually the source information is relatively obvious, easy to locate. And that should be clear also where data and types of information came from, how it was analyzed, how the final report was compiled. This is effectively transparency of method. The date it was issued should be easy to find. If the report is older, try to find a more recent version or an update. So that gives us information on currency. All right, let's move through. So here's some examples of where you can search for grey literature. Actually, there's a lot of repositories, websites, databases that collect and bring together and make accessible to researchers such as ourselves different aspects of grey literature. So Web of Science, Scopus, IEEE, Business Source Complete, ProQuest dissertations and theses, an opportunity where you can access a significant number of PhD dissertations, master's theses from contributing universities around the world. This is not all universities, and this is not all researchers, because people can opt not to make their thesis available on ProQuest. Older theses are now being digitized. I think British National Library is doing a very good project to digitize all PhD theses that are older than a particular date to make them available to researchers who may need them. Aston Research Explorer, BASE, we have relevant mailing lists such as JISC Mail, social networking sites that are for academic use. So LinkedIn, ResearchGate, do join ResearchGate if you already haven't. I'm not getting a commission for that, but it's one of the opportunities that are out there. NHS networks, Grey Guide, Open Grey. So a good number of these places that are available. The challenge though is it becomes very difficult for us to search grey literature, mainly because there is a lack of cataloging and records management. So even what I've just talked about, although it brings together a significant amount of the grey literature that is available out there, there's going to be a lot that falls through the cracks. So again, don't just sit at the laptop. You have to find ways to look for and approach people, organizations, opportunities that may be able to provide you with different source material that's relevant. When we look at using electronic methods to access, we have problems, what's called the filter bubble. You know, we get a bias with display limits, we get a bias with algorithms, there are a limited number of search engine results pages, maybe there's a lack of metadata or controlled terminology to tag, so it doesn't filter through easily for us with, with search engines. Google is predicated on the fact that SEO is a key or important element of what businesses and other organizations do for their website and for elements of that. But grey literature is simply about putting it out there, not necessarily making it easy for you to find. We have a problem with the changing nature of websites and domain URLs. You know, just because it's in one place today doesn't mean you're going to find it again into the future, which means it's difficult to track back older documents. Hence, as a researcher, and ignore the environmental impact I make of this, but I print absolutely everything I get online because I cannot guarantee that I'm going to be able to access it again into the future. So something to consider, that even though you may not be able to find it again, and that's going to have citation issues, but it can be addressed, make sure that you have a copy of it, because if you ever have to defend your choice of usage of that, at least you can pull out from your files a nice file, accessed on, full URL at the date, full content, so you have a backup in that respect. There's always going to be ambiguity in grey literature documents, so inaccurate titles, lack of reporting standards. There's also a huge potential for organizations to lose knowledge as a result of grey literature being lost or forgotten. And interestingly enough, I was doing some searching the other day, looking for a particular topic I used to be interested in many years ago. And I was trying to download a copy of a particular manuscript that I wanted. But I came across a slightly older manuscript that I'd never ever seen before. And it was only available, on one link. But it was interesting that the knowledge contained therein was good. It was something that had a lot of potential to have been developed. And I know it hasn't been developed because I've read quite extensively in that field. But it's sad that this is potentially literature of value that has now been lost because it's not something that is particularly repetitive online or easy to access in that respect. Let's talk about searching grey literature. And the diagram that is up now, key components of a search, gives a reasonable overview. I'm going to talk about the top 3/4 of the diagram rather than the managing the search element. In terms of planning your search, you need to make sure you develop a search plan. This is a strategy. Where are your potential sources? What are the search terms or search string that you might want to use? What might be the limits associated with this? You need to make sure that you can adapt your search plan to accommodate technological advances in social media, other information sharing systems. But make sure you provide for yourself predefined boundaries and limits for searching, such as setting the number of pages to be screened. This is going to help with time management. I mean, truth is, you can go in with a complex search string and spend 8 hours just looking and not necessarily coming up with the results that you would want. You want to look at your key search sources. So your grey literature databases, we've mentioned a few before, and I will mention a few more shortly. Customized Google search engines. So this may be search engines that are within a different organization that have been designed to limit to a particular field. So university libraries are very good at having these museums and so forth. They will help limit, but they'll also mean it gets rid of a lot of the unnecessary fluff that has no relevance to what you're researching. Think about the potential to consult with experts and who these key experts may be. So identifying individuals that may be important, making a request, usually via email. And, you know, if they don't answer you after 3 attempts, just give up on that one because they're obviously not going to be helpful. But make sure you document the request, because when you talk about the approaches that you have made to get information, to get data sources, to do the research, you may want to be able to reflect on this situation as well. We also have to look at conference abstracts and proceedings, because these are potential areas or facilities, I guess, that have value to us. You want to think about your search techniques as well. So the concept of hand searching, you know, it's a technique that is basically involves manually reviewing tables of contents and organizations' online publications to see if there's something of relevance. So we might get a conference we might get a conference report, and there may be 200 different presentations within it. We now need to go through all of those from the table of contents to identify, is there something that is relevant? These may not show up on a typical database or Google-based search, which means it then becomes our responsibility for us to do it ourselves. So hand searching is done to find studies that may not have been indexed in the databases. It is a manual process. You know, it's looking through journals page by page. Often involves looking at each reference in each journal article found. And I've done this myself many times, where I've looked at a particular journal that's been interesting, and then I've data mined the reference list. Or I've gone through somebody else's dissertation and I've data mined the reference list because I wanted to see whether there may be a correlation or a potential contribution that can use for myself as well. You know, you're going to look at not only your journal articles, but your conference papers. You may be looking at company annual reports, so many different things where you're literally just going to have to do this. But make sure again that you document the hand searching process so that you've got records. A consideration that you have to include is language filters. You know, perhaps you want to incorporate a language filter, but use any language filters with discretion, because excluding information from another language may have limitations. Now, most researchers that I interact with will say, you know, use an English language filter. The problem is some of my research that I'm interested in isn't limited to English publications. But what you can do to make it easy for you is look for translated abstracts first, and then work backwards to the source and see how you want to deal with that. If you have specific language filters uh, in your search strings that actually may bias findings, because sometimes the actual research is better in a language different to ours. So we might want to include languages other than our language of publication. It becomes warranted when there are going to be systematic differences between studies reported in journals. It may be a methodological difference. It may be differences in findings, which you've got to be, as a holistic researcher, appreciative of, and to be able to think through, does that change anything for me? There may be a situation that most of the relevant studies have actually been reported in a language other than your language of publication, which means you can't ignore them just because of the inconvenience of language. But it's something that we still have to find a way to address and to work with. And we might also have a situation that most of the studies have been conducted overseas, which means the language of the research and the language of the discussion may not actually be in the language that we are using as well. If we start search permutations, and this is basically your search strings, are we trying to include or exclude? What are the combinations that we are using? The best way is to execute several search strategies containing multiple combinations of your keywords for each source that you've searched. This can yield more relevant hits, but as it yields more relevant hits, it's also going to help you in aspects of triangulation and verification of different sources and different resources that you get. And we might hit a point of data saturation, which is when the execution of additional searches doesn't yield any additional information. So if you find yourself 6 hours in front of your computer and you're finding no new hits, you've kind of hit a limit, and that would be the good time to cease for a while what you are doing. In terms of risks, there is a risk of bias and the value of information. And effectively, any risk of bias comes across within any information as dependent in part upon the question it is being used to answer. All of our research should be driven by questions. So make sure that what you're looking at in terms of the grey literature, understand what their research question was. What were they trying to answer? How does that correlate to what you are trying to answer? And therefore, is it relevant to what you have, and should you be making use of it? I'm just going to come back to some sources of grey literature. And in terms of international grey literature, there's actually a huge selection. You know, WorldCat, for example, holdings of over 20,000 worldwide libraries, 1.5 billion items. You've also got sites and indexes that collect grey literature. So Core, Billyfield Academic Search Engine, or BASE, Open Grey, GreySource, Science.gov, Policy Archives, Worldwide Science, ARSIV, very difficult one to say that, PACE International, GreyNet International, Open Door, and even our old favorite Google. All of these are useful for us to know about. And if you're keen, I'm happy to put together a very quick reference guide to some of these. So if you want to drop us an email, I'm more than happy to send that to you as a subsequent follow-up. If we want to look at conference papers, you know, we have conferencealerts.com, which gives us monthly emails of all the conferences that are happening and so forth. Conference papers via ProQuest that can help us give an overview. Digital dissertations in text to scientific and technical proceedings an element of Web of Science. ZTOC, a research database with 30,000 journals and over 50 million article citations, to conference papers. Then we can look at where we can get access to dissertations, theses, and academic papers. Open Grey we talked about, ProQuest dissertation, Theses Global, WorldCat dissertation. So we see some themes as to the organizations that are doing this, but we have the opportunity that we have access to a lot of what will be considered grey data. And it is in effectively easy to search resources. Now, just to finish off, I want to talk about legal issues. And I want to talk about the legal issues because not only did I touch upon it a little bit, maybe in historical research, but also in copyright in your thesis. We do have to look at the fact that, some of these grey literature elements that we may be investigating or trying to utilize, some of these may still, for our use, infringe copyright. So be very careful about what you use. And if you are going to make use of some of this, as with a lot of other resources that we do ensure that you get your permissions. Do ensure that you get a record of these permissions in case you ever have to defend yourself. And the last issue is about personal data processing. A lot of historical grey literature was probably curated well before personal data protection laws came into being. Now that's fine, that covers them. But if you're reproducing any of this and intend to make use of it, be aware that just because they are protected does not mean you are protected as well. So make sure that whatever you do still protects according to the current level of legislation as of your publishing, rather than what was acceptable in previous years prior to such legislation turning up or being curated to protect individuals. So I hope I've given a bit of an overview as to what grey literature is and some of the issues associated with it. It is a wide area, and what's available in terms of grey literature will differ significantly depending upon what your research area is, your discipline, even your location. But the common themes and principles come down to how are we going to verify, how are we going to define its credibility, and how are we going to use the resources themselves as part of our research journey, even if we're not using it in terms of our final dissertation write-up. It may be used to pose questions for us, or to just get us to think about certain issues from a different perspective. Anyway, I'll hand over to my moderator now, and I'm happy to take any questions, but let me hand over first. Thank you.